I want to move away from transfer stories just for a moment because last week there were a couple of developments that fans may or may not be aware of that relate to the London Stadium. But before I go into detail, if you're new to this channel or if you've watched the West Ham Voice before but yet to subscribe, a QR code in that top corner there takes you to the subscription page. Click on that, become a subscriber, costs nothing to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoy the content, why not subscribe? So, last week, West Ham agreed to let the 2029 World Athletic Championships take place in September of that year, which will have an impact on some of our home fixture lists. I think the timing of this agreement is quite important because at almost exactly the same time as West Ham having announced this agreement with London Stadium LLP, the people that operate the stadium, and with Athletic Ventures, Amanda Staveley is talking about potentially buying the London Stadium if she gets control of West Ham. And that gives us two completely different ways of looking at the future of the stadium itself. One is essentially work with the people who operate it and try to make it better for West Ham. The other, buy the stadium and take control of it. I'm not so sure that the second option is necessarily as straightforward as some fans might think. So let's start with what West Ham have actually agreed. The club has confirmed that the London Stadium will form part of London's bid for the 2029 World Athletic Championships. Now, if that bid is successful, West Ham could potentially have to play 2, maybe 3 games away from home. It all depends on the division that we're in at that time and how the footballing calendar is arranged for the 29-30 season. And I completely understand why some supporters would be unhappy about that. The Fan Advisory Board has already made its concerns known, particularly around the principle that West Ham are supposed to have priority access to the stadium during a football season, and they're quite right to point that out. That was one of the big selling points of the concession agreements when West Ham moved to the London Stadium. So on the face of it, you can understand the reaction. But what interests me is what West Ham say they will get in return. Because buried in the statement that they put on the official West Ham website, this came up. And it says, as part of the new agreement, the club and the London Stadium will work together to deliver a number of new initiatives that will enhance the stadium and matchday experience for supporters. Now, we don't know exactly what these initiatives are yet, but the sentence could turn out to be quite important as part of this whole announcement, because this feels like something that's kind of changed in the relationship between West Ham and London Stadium LLP. And I think Karim Virani is central to that change. For years, the relationship between West Ham and stadium operators has often seemed quite unnecessarily adversarial. And we now know that this was more down to Karen Brady's bullish approach to the London Stadium operators than anything else. Anytime West Ham wanted something, or anytime the operators wanted something, there was a bit of a standoff. There was never seemed to be a sort of an agreement that seemed to benefit both parties. And there were times that West Ham and the London Stadium went to court over matters. Now, that hardly leads to a collaborative working partnership. But Karim Virani seems to be taking a different approach, probably under the guidance of Daniel Kretinsky, but Virani is the man at the helm at this moment in time. Now, rather than treating London Stadium LLP as an opponent, the idea appears to be that West Ham should work closer together with them. And commercially, that could make an awful lot of sense, because the stadium isn't in a particularly healthy financial position, as we know. The London Stadium LLP is losing around £19 million a year. And one of the ways it wants to improve that position is to attract more major events, particularly concerts. And this is where West Ham could actually have something useful to offer. The stadium want more events. West Ham wants the stadium to work better for football. So why not make those two things work closer together? concerts can be particularly attractive because the stadium can be converted back to football relatively quickly. If London Stadium LLP can put on more concerts, generate more revenue, and then get the stadium ready for West Ham's next home fixture without a huge amount of disruption, everyone benefits. And that's where I think the relationship could become much more interesting in time. Because if West Ham is prepared to be accommodating, then West Ham should expect something in return. And that's where I'd expect these new initiatives to come in. If you're asking West Ham supporters to accept more concerts, more events, and occasionally given up access to the stadium during the footballing season, then there's got to be something more tangible for West Ham fans. Maybe that's better seating configuration, maybe finding a way of getting the supporters closer to the pitch, maybe proper standing areas, family zones, and so on. All these things that the Fan Advisory Board have been pushing for. And West Ham have often said, can't do it, the stadium owners won't allow it. But if there's a better collaborative working relationship, then perhaps some of these things become easier to achieve if the stadium operators start making money out of the stadium itself. And that could be a win-win situation. And I think this is much more interesting, a much more interesting proposition than simply arguing about whether West Ham should have to say yes or no to an athletic event in 2029. Because athletics, those championships are just one event. The relationship between West Ham and London Stadium LLP could potentially last for decades. Now bring Amanda Staveley into the equation and things start to change completely. Because if Staveley does get control of West Ham United and then she does try to buy the London Stadium, fans are going to get excited by that. Apparently now, the Mayor of London is open to the potential sale of the stadium with a figure of around £50 million being suggested. Now you can understand why West Ham fans will be excited by this. For a lot of fans, the dream is still to somehow turn this stadium into a proper footballing environment. Get rid of the running track, move supporters closer to the pitch, all that sort of stuff. And if someone is telling you that they're going to buy it and do exactly that, of course people are going to listen. But there's a huge difference between buying the building and buying yourself a clean slate. Because here, you don't get a clean slate. The athletic concession is the obvious example. The agreement, which dates back to 2013, runs for 50 years. So there are like 30 odd years still left on the athletic concession. If Staveley buys the stadium, she doesn't simply get to say, we're done with athletics. There would have to be negotiations around that concession. And if the athletic operation has to be moved elsewhere, or the concession bought out or whatever, that's going to cost money on top of the 50 million you pay for the stadium. Now, no one knows what that would cost. Then you've got other contractual arrangements as well, which are attached to the stadium. Delaware North, as a prime example, has a long-term catering agreement covering the venue itself. So again, ownership doesn't mean you walk in on a Monday morning and start ripping up old contracts. There are existing agreements, existing rights, and existing obligations that have to be abided by. And that's before you even start to talk about the cost of changing the stadium itself. So when we hear a figure of £50 million being suggested as a possible purchase price, I'd be very careful about thinking that. Brilliant. Every fan is going to say 50 mil. That's great. Nothing for the consortium that Staveley is putting together. But then you start looking at the purchase price and then everything else on top. You'd have the existing cost of dealing with the arrangements and the contracts that are in place, the cost of redeveloping, and the ongoing cost of the operation of the stadium itself. And remember, this is an asset whose operator is currently losing a substantial amount of money each year. So you have to ask yourself, what are you actually trying to achieve? Is the objective to own the stadium, or is the objective to make the stadium work better for West Ham fans? Because they're not necessarily the same thing. And this is where I think maybe Kretinsky's approach deserves a little bit of credit. I'm not saying that the London Stadium suddenly becomes perfect just because Karim Virani has developed a better working relationship with the operators. It doesn't. The running track is still there. The sight lines are never going to be what they were at the Boleyn, and supporters aren't suddenly going to forget everything that's happened since the stadium move. But we are going to be at the London Stadium for a very long time to come. West Ham has its own long-term concession there, as does, as I've mentioned, the Athletics. The stadium operator has its responsibilities, the commercial agreements, as I've said, the catering, etc., etc. So perhaps the smartest thing West Ham can do is make the current reality work in its favour. And that means having people around the table who kind of understand that this isn't just about winning arguments, it's about negotiating. If London Stadium LLP wants more concerts, West Ham can make that happen. But in return, West Ham should be saying, fine, what are you going to do for our supporters? That's a much more powerful position than simply refusing everything. And it potentially creates an entirely different working relationship between the London Stadium LLP and West Ham United. Because if the stadium starts becoming more commercially successful because of hosting more events, then that gives the operator more incentive to actually invest in the stadium itself. And if West Ham is one of the reasons why the commercial model starts to work, the club has considerably more leverage when it comes to asking for improvements. And that's where you could potentially see meaningful change to this whole footballing experience. And that, to me, that's the fascinating part of all this, because perhaps the answer to the London Stadium isn't necessarily ownership. Perhaps it's all about influence. West Ham doesn't have to own every brick of that stadium, to make it work for supporters. All right, look, if Staveley comes in and buys the stadium, invests a fortune in it, and genuinely makes it a better footballing ground, now I'm not going to complain. Of course I wouldn't. But if someone can turn the stadium into a much better experience for West Ham, of course I'll be all for it. But I don't think that we should automatically assume that buying the stadium is the cheaper, easier, or even a better option. It could become an incredibly complicated project. And that's why I think the current approach for Kretinsky is kind of worth watching. If we forge a better working relationship between the club and the stadium operators, then the outcome surely has to be a better footballing experience for West Ham fans. The old approach under Brady was very much about protecting your own corner. The club has already told us that new initiatives will be introduced to improve the stadium and the matchday experience. So it sounds like we've already achieved some kind of breakthrough. Now we need to see what those initiatives actually are. And if they're meaningful, then perhaps giving up a couple of home games in 2029 will be worth the effort. But we're not giving up home games, because if you look at the other side of the coin, is that we'll have more home games in close succession later on in the season. So I don't know. Would it be a bad thing? I think it tells us something about the direction West Ham is taking under Kretinsky and Virani. Kretinsky doesn't appear to be looking at the stadium and saying, we need to get out of this. He's looking at it and saying, we're going to be here for the long term. How do we make it work better for us? And Karim Virani looks to be the person tasked with making that happen. Now, look, as I've said again, if Staveley eventually does get a foot in the club and she really does want the stadium, then I want to see how she's going to navigate her way around all the contractual obligations that have been mentioned. It could become a long-winded logistical nightmare that West Ham are going to have to own. The biggest mistake we could make is assuming that it's the only way to fix the London Stadium. Maybe owning it isn't the only option. Maybe you don't need to buy it and knock it down. Maybe you just need the right people sitting around the table and finally accepting that West Ham and London Stadium LLP are actually in this together. If Kretinsky and Virani can achieve that, then perhaps the whole story actually is much more positive for West Ham than initially appears to be. I think the real prize in this is, what are West Ham going to get out of this? Because that's what I'm looking to see happen. And if it means a better footballing experience, then maybe giving up a couple of home games early in a season in 2029 might be worth a while.